when it isn't just that prices at the grocery store are a little higher or it's a little harder to get car parts, but that you have to send your husband or your son to the front lines for cannon fodder. And that is something that everybody knows that's what they're going for. Like, there is not really any doubt about what these men are being sent to the front for. They know they're not going to get any training. They're not getting any equipment.
I'm Benjamin Wittes, and this is the Lawfare podcast, October 3rd, 2022. There's been a lot going on in Russia. A partial mobilization, protests, a mysterious explosion underwater along the Nord Stream pipelines, and, most recently, the annexation of seized Ukrainian territory in a bizarre ceremony in Moscow. To go over it all, I sat down with Julia Ioffe, currently of Puck News, one of the most astute Russia watchers in the news business, and Alexander Vindman, Lawfare's Pritzker military fellow, and a former Eastern Europe and Russia specialist for the NSC. They were actually two separate conversations, but I knitted them together into one. We talked about the explosions along the Nord Stream pipeline, about which the two have very different instincts. We talked about the protests, we talked about the annexations, and we talked about the threat of nuclear escalation. It's the Lawfare podcast, October 3rd. What's going on in Russia with Vindman and Ioffe? So we've got a whole lot of stuff going on related to Russia and the Ukraine war, and I wanted to cover three broad topics with you. The annexations that took place on Friday, the partial mobilization that began a week earlier, and the explosions in the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. So let's take them in reverse order and start with the annexations. I'm interested for your sense of why these are important for Vladimir Putin. The world will not recognize them. They don't change the situation on the ground militarily. Why does it matter to the Russian government whether it calls these four additional oblasts part of Russia as opposed to occupied Ukrainian territory?
Well, the first thing is that it allows, after 7 months of war that have been pretty unsuccessful by any measure for Russia, it allows Putin to show something to his population, that he has accomplished at least something. He has not denazified Ukraine. He has not toppled the regime. He has not done pretty much anything that he had set out to do back in February, but at least he can show his population, and more importantly, the so-called party of war, the hardliners that are to his right and that have been putting a significant amount of pressure on him over the summer to do more, and in their sense, to stop fighting this war with one hand tied behind their back. He can now show them something, that he has accomplished something. He has now added to Russia's territory. He has expanded Russia's empire, while today, of course, decrying colonialism, ironically. So there's that. And the second thing is that he can now say that this is Russian territory that Russia is defending rather than Ukrainian territory that it is attacking. And so when Ukrainian troops go to liberate it in the coming days and weeks, it will, in Russia's mind and the Russian quote unquote legal system, it will look like an attack on the Russian homeland rather than just a movement back and forth across the battlefield, which would, in Putin's mind and in the mind of Russians, justify more extreme measures, because this is now tantamount to Rostovskaya Oblast, Moscow, etc., that this isn't just some battlefield territory.
He could now declare a victory, even though it's a hollow victory. On paper, he now expanded Russian lands. He's that great gatherer of lands. There are 4 additional regions that now fall under Russian control. And even if they can't really hang on to him, he could claim that as some sort of win, and then negotiate. Attempt to get the Ukrainians to negotiate. The other thing he could do is justify a basis from which to potentially further escalate. And that would be moving beyond this special military operation to a general mobilization or declaration of war based on Russian lands being attacked. So it gives them some additional room to then rally the Russian population around this notion of defending Russian lands, that Russia, as it's claimed it throughout its history, is not the aggressor. It only goes to war to defend itself. It's one of those critical kind of narratives about Russian history, about Russian war making that he's playing towards. Beyond that, I think there's supposed to be a warning that it's supposed to warn off a Western support for Ukraine. That's not going to happen. I think that whether he realizes it or not, he probably should at this point, because if anything, the West has kind of matched his escalation with some sort of escalation, not symmetrically, but still matching his escalations with resolve. Beyond that, I really don't know what else he might be thinking, because if you asked me about 2 weeks ago, before this referendum was announced, I would have said that it would be folly for him to pursue this course of action, mainly because as a huge bluff, his bluff would be called. He'd have to go kind of all in, and that would be particularly dangerous because he doesn't really have much more wiggle room for escalation beyond kind of nuclear weapons of mass destruction, and he's not really interested in going that direction yet. And it actually waters down the unique status of Crimea as Russian territory. Now, with all these additional annexations, I don't think that Zelensky or the other Ukrainian elites would be as open to this idea of setting aside the question of the Crimea question and letting it kind of play out over the long run with kind of a diplomatic course of action, as Zelensky has said multiple times he was prepared to do. So Putin's harmed his own kind of position here. Crimea was formally annexed. It became Russian territory, according to only the Russians and some fringe other governments. But whereas these other regions were separatist controlled in the Russian language, now they're all in the same kind of basket, and warning off Ukraine from liberating Crimea is undermined.
And when you say more extreme measures, this has been accompanied by a certain degree of nuclear saber rattling, which is by no means unheard of for Russia, particularly since the beginning of the war, but does seem to be alarming people in a way that it perhaps didn't in February. Do you see more extreme measures here? Is that a euphemism for nuclear escalation, or are there more extreme measures short of nuclear force that Putin has at his disposal?
Yes, is the answer. I mean, you saw that already in the lead up to today's signing ceremony. You saw a convoy of civilian cars that was bombed in the Zaporozhye region, where about 30 civilians were killed when a massive missile landed, where these civilians were congregating to register to go into Russian occupied territory and either rescue relatives or to get stuff and take it back out. And the scenes were just horrible. The Russians have started really stepping back up, I should say, their attacks on civilians in Ukraine in the lead up to Friday's signing ceremony. So that's one thing. Putin has also talked in recent days about going after civilian infrastructure inside Ukraine, going after electric power plants. We saw Russian forces hit a dam in Kryvyi Rih, which is Zelensky's hometown, which is, I think, not a coincidence at all. And Russian forces hit this dam repeatedly, which caused the town to flood. So I think A, we're going to see more stuff like that, and B, the nuclear threat was not an idle one back in February either. I just think that it is more of a real threat now because he's doing far worse now. It has been 7 months of him doing badly, and the worse he's doing on the battlefield, the more likely he is to resort to some kind of nuclear power play. And it's his only kind of way out, I think, in his mind, out of the corner that he's increasingly backed into. There was an excellent piece by an amazing Russian journalist, independent Russian journalist named Farida Rostamova, that was printed in the Moscow Times in its English version. And the headline was taken from a quote of a source that she has close to the Kremlin. And it was, Putin always chooses escalation. And I think that really is kind of the nub of the issue and has been all along.
So do you think when you say the nuclear threat was not idle in February and it's not idle now, Putin has been more careful indeed than in word about escalation involving the West. And he knows very well that any actual nuclear escalation, as opposed to talk of it, is a big shining red line for Western governments, including the United States. At this point, is he just so backed into a corner that he doesn't care, or is this still something that it's just a lot easier for him to talk about than actually to contemplate doing?
Oh, the other thing I should say is that, there are other steps in between. He can still hit, the depots through which NATO countries are supplying Ukraine with weapons, for example. But there are a whole range of options. He could, let's say, hit a gas pipeline in Danish waters or just off of Danish waters, maybe. But I do think right now it is talk, and I think it is intended to be a kind of psychological escalation, and it's intended to get into the heads of Westerners who are afraid of a direct war with Russia, even though, there is already a direct war with Russia happening for all intents and purposes. It is to kind of make the Western public and Western leaders think twice about how much they actually want to support Ukraine, whether they want to force Ukraine to the negotiating table. I don't think Putin is backed into a corner enough just yet to use a nuclear weapon, but that's not to say that he won't get there. I think it's certainly foreseeable. He's really not doing well, and I don't think this mobilization is going to help him all that much.
I'm concerned, but I'm not overly concerned. Primarily from a standpoint of indications and warnings, what we call it I&W. I don't think we've hit some of the benchmarks, which I'm happy to expound on here in a second. But I would also go back to this point that this is not just what Putin's been doing since the beginning of this major escalation in 2022. He did the same thing back in 2014 when he annexed Crimea, and he did some nuclear signaling to warn off a kind of Western response, what he would call Western interference. So this has been a long kind of often played trump card for Putin to try to get the West to back off, not take action in response. Now, with regards to the potential for a nuclear escalation here, I still think that he's a logical actor in certain ways. He will push as far as he can without directly risking his regime's survival. So that means there is a hard limit to attacking NATO because that would have direct implications to his regime. He's still bound by this ironclad doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Nobody wins a nuclear war. And then the follow-on question would be, well, what does that mean for Ukraine that doesn't have a nuclear deterrent? Well, Ukraine is gotten some interesting coverage from the U.S. and the West now. The rhetoric around what would happen in case of a nuclear employment from the U.S. from this administration, the Biden administration, has been that it would be a complete game changer and entirely change kind of the future conduct of this war, which could be perceived as a signal that NATO would get directly involved. It could be perceived as a signal that NATO could go after kind of the Black Sea Fleet or wherever these nuclear weapons originated from. It adds a huge element of strategic ambiguity, which is pretty powerful doctrine that makes Putin wonder what could be the end result of the scenario. Does it mean the thing that he most wants to avoid, which is regime ending kind of war? He has to have a pretty high degree of confidence before he plays that nuclear card. And even there, I think there are some things that are currently complicating his decision making. Where would he use a nuclear weapon? He doesn't have very high confidence that he could deliver, or his military at least doesn't have a very high confidence that they could deliver a nuclear payload freely anywhere in Ukraine. They would have to potentially use a hypersonic, this Kinjal system that they have, relatively small, modest amount of, to be quite certain that they get it to the target. The traditional cruise missiles that they have are not an effective delivery mechanism. They're only about 30% effective in reaching a target. That means you would need to potentially fire 3 nuclear weapons in order to have one of them kind of get through, in just a kind of mathematical terms. And 3 nuclear weapons is a major escalation, whereas one is a major escalation in itself, but different than firing multiple nuclear weapons. So that means you would have to potentially employ it around the front lines, maybe along the coast in a place like Odessa, which would be a huge escalation. And a place like Odessa would have a massive impact, but almost anywhere else that there are fighting formations that he's trying to have like some sort of military effect on, it's actually not going to be decisive. Because there have actually been some good, interesting articles about what happens if you use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. What kind of effects does it have? They're rather limited. The Ukrainians are operating out of armored vehicles that were built to withstand pretty much everything minus a direct nuclear blast. So if you're within 500 meters, you're pretty much toast. But anything further out has a very good chance of survival, including the folks outside of that radius. There are positions that are dug in. So the military effects of using one tactical nuclear weapon are not decisive. So it's mainly a signaling tool with a huge blowback. So I think I don't want to be dismissive of the fact that there could be a nuclear use, but it's still a very improbable notion. There would be other things that we would potentially see. I would imagine we would see a declaration of war, like, and this converting from a special military operation to a defensive war of some sorts. That would be a big indicator. We would probably see a whole bunch of civil defense exercises, nuclear readiness exercises. We would see some other kind of, maybe we might see a chemical use along the way as a precursor to kind of say the next step is a nuclear weapon. We might see these types of things unfold beforehand. So we still have some headroom before, I start to get really anxious. Now, at the same time, this is probably the most dangerous it's been in terms of what the probabilities are for nuclear war. And it's deeply unfortunate that we allowed the situation to kind of get here. When I say we allowed, I mean the United States taking this very kind of slow, methodical view of ramping up Ukrainian capabilities to defend themselves, instead of slamming the door on Russia being able to achieve its military objectives earlier in this war, before Putin put as much credibility in it, before he put as much regime stake into this war, before he ended up gaining some sort of footing with an eastern campaign that clawed a little bit of territory. This was foreseeable in certain ways, with a longer kind of military campaign between Russia and Ukraine, and we didn't do enough to avert it.
So let's talk about the mobilization. He announced a mobilization more than a week ago now that was supposedly limited to reservists. It's clearly in practice not limited to reservists, but is kind of a dragooning of every male, particularly of a Caucasian or minority complexion that security forces can kind of get their hands on. It's causing a huge exodus of people. How much of this do you think the government anticipated, and how much of this is a reaction among the public that has caught them by surprise?
I think it's the latter. I think the feedback mechanism between the public and the state has been broken for a very long time, which is what happens in dictatorships, especially in dictatorships like this one where they drink their own Kool-Aid. Putin and the people around him really believe the stuff that they see on TV, which is also the stuff that they have put on TV. And I think that is kind of the danger of pacifying your population to such an extent that they say that they know to tell pollsters, they know to say that they support the war, but when push comes to shove and when they actually have to do something to support the war, when it isn't just that prices at the grocery store are a little higher or it's a little harder to get car parts, but that you have to send your husband or your son to the front lines for cannon fodder. And that is something that everybody knows that's what they're going for. Like, there is not really any doubt about what these men are being sent to the front for. They know they're not going to get any training. They're not getting any equipment. People are basically crowdfunding for their husbands and sons and fathers because the Russian army isn't equipping them with much of anything. Maybe a uniform, maybe a rusty rifle. But you see families basically sending out fundraising requests to their friends and neighbors saying, hey, we need, a few $1,000s worth of equipment for our son or father, whatever, because, and this is even, in wealthy Moscow. So there are no illusions about what they're being sent for. And in that case, people aren't really for it, right? And suddenly, a war that they were fine passively supporting seems like much less of a good idea when they have to just go and be cannon fodder, or in the Russian parlance, cannon meat. So I think they were quite surprised. You could see that they weren't prepared for the mass exodus because it took the state many days to catch up to the situation at the various border points at the airports, to set up military recruitment points at the border crossings, to send draft lists to border patrol agents at the airports, and to start checking, passenger lists against the draft list. It took them several days. It took them essentially until the exact number that Putin had announced he was calling up had fled the country. So it tells you that on one hand, they had planned for this mobilization for a long time because it took, a couple hours for the draft notices to start going out, but they clearly had no idea that this was going to be the response.
I don't think they've anticipated this kind of blowback. I think they generally had some anticipation of additional instability. That was indicated by the fact that he delayed even this partial mobilization as long as he did, and chose to pursue a partial instead of a general mobilization. They knew this was going to be create some sort of instability. But even so, it's kind of interesting to see the flight of tens of thousands of people, significant protests in ethnic enclaves in the Caucasus and in Dagestan and stuff like that. That's just kind of starting to unfold. I don't know. I mean, they had apprehensions in general, but I don't think they could have necessarily predicted that things would quite unfold this way. And you're absolutely right. The target is ethnic minorities. I don't think that's accidental. The Russians are very, very chauvinist. They think that The ethnic minorities wasting their lives on this war is actually potentially a good thing, that they have less minorities to deal with. They don't have those acute demographic challenges that you hear a lot of the kind of the Russian nationalists talk about. They're out on the periphery. They can't do too much trouble. They're thousands of kilometers away. But they're also going after folks in the big cities too, and I think they're going to have to dip into those areas eventually. So I think we're seeing just kind of the start of this next phase of instability as this war does not deliver as promised the glories that Putin had assured his population of, that there are sanctions that are having an increasing bite, and there are folks that are not coming back in large numbers.
Russia has seen significant protests nationwide. The Navalny movement has certainly generated them. There have been prior rounds of anti-government protests. I'm not sure I've seen ones on this scale that have involved so many people so personally threatened by a specific government policy. Is this different in kind, in your judgment, from Russian protest movements of the past, or is it just kind of the same sort of thing and on a scale that's very handleable by the repressive apparatus of the Putin government?
Yes and no. So we've seen protests like this, including in some of these same regions like Dagestan. I've actually seen them myself, and they happened back in 2017 when the Platon taxing system was introduced on long haul truck drivers who basically, were barely making a living wage. The profit margins were very small. And in response to basically Western sanctions that targeted the Rottenberg brothers, Putin's childhood judo buddies, the Kremlin introduced this new per kilometer tax system for long haul truck drivers that money would go directly to the Rottenberg brothers. It was basically compensation for the sanctions that would just be taken off the backs of these working class men. And you saw these working class protests that were not political, they were economic in nature. And these miles long, basically protest traffic jams of 18-wheelers stretched out all across the country, including in regions like Dagestan, which are generally, they generally deliver the vote that is needed of them. Their local authorities, rustle up the votes that are needed, and they're kind of North Korean in nature. They'll deliver like 93% for Putin or his party. As a result, these kinds of protests are the ones that the Kremlin fears the most because they're not political in nature. These aren't people who are asking for free and fair elections or for Putin to leave office. They're not asking for freedom of speech or release of political prisoners. They're not even going out for Navalny. They don't like Navalny. They think he's a nationalist and they're scared of him. They're coming out for bread and butter issues. And that scares the Kremlin the most because that's real for them. That's more real to them than the white collar whiners. So I think these kinds of protests are very scary to them because they're of a similar nature. And these are mothers, right? These aren't men protesting. So it's kind of harder to crack down on women, on mothers, on often Muslim mothers in headscarves and hijabs who are coming out and yelling at cops. There was one extremely powerful video of a mother in Kabardino-Balkaria, which doesn't often protest. Just she's so upset that she tears off her headscarf because it's already falling off because she's so passionately screaming at this cop. And she's saying, I'd like to know how you would feel if your son was fighting down there. And these impassioned, it's just harder to arrest these mothers. Not that they're not doing it. In Tuva yesterday, actually, they arrested a mother and her infant in a stroller. They took the stroller and the infant into police custody. It didn't stop them. So, and they're still pretty small. I think people are still so scared because the repressive measures especially of the last year, have become so extreme and so brutal that most people are scared. That's why most people are protesting by leaving. But the fact that these women are like they're still more scared of their sons dying. And from what I've heard, women in these Muslim areas are like, at this point they have nothing to lose. If they lose their children, they don't care if they, go out into the square and get shot or arrested. So that's scarier, but still the numbers are like a few hundred here, a few hundred there. That's still, I think the Kremlin is scared of it, but hoping that it'll die down, that they'll get tired of protesting, that if they arrest enough people, it'll stop. But if they don't stop, then they might have a problem on their hands.
So the departure numbers are not small in contrast to the protest numbers. And Russia already has something of a shortage of men because of the limited life expectancy of men in Russia. You lose several 100,000 relatively young men. That's a big deal. Are they functionally going to be able to stop this exodus, or is the alternative to cancel the mobilization, or do they just imagine they will ride it out?
In general, they try to turn the screws and become more repressive and try to ride it out. They never really cancel what they're doing because that's a sign of weakness, and if you show any signs of weakness, you're done. So they won't cancel. I can't imagine them canceling the mobilization. A, they feel like they need those men, and B, that would just be unimaginable. It would just be an admission of a mistake, and that's just, again, in that kind of culture, would be basically saying, come and kill me. So I think you're going to see more detentions at border posts, more not allowing men of a certain age to leave the country, which kind of you've seen Ukraine doing since the beginning of the war.
Seen Ukraine doing it largely without complaint, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, because they're defending their country. And again, that's a morale issue, right? Because they're actually defending their country. Their war is justified. And if anything, you're seeing Ukrainians shame the men who have managed to leave by hook and by crook, and those men being ashamed of themselves. Whereas in Russia, it's like the people who are being shamed are the people who are going and responding to the draft notices and going to the military recruitment posts. It's like, are you dumb? Like, why would you go fight in this criminal war? If you don't have the means to leave the country, go to jail. At least you'll remain alive and you won't have to kill innocent people.
so one area where, like, I will say this neutrally, there has been an escalation, not merely a threat of one, is that somebody seems to have blown up Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 underwater somewhere just outside the territorial waters of Denmark. First of all, how confident are you that this is a Russian operation, not, as Tucker Carlson seems to believe, a US operation, or as many other people seem to believe, a Ukrainian operation?
I don't know. I don't think we know yet. And anyone who says they know is lying, or they've seen some kind of evidence that none of the rest of us have seen. I can see it plausibly being a number of culprits, but I don't think we know yet who did it.
And what do you think the plausible explanations are?
I think for Russia, if the argument is that Russia did it, the plausible explanation is it is punishing Europe for supporting Ukraine. And, Putin repeatedly blaming the West for doing this, both in his annexation speech and the day before, and calling it terrorism. The more they kind of vociferously deny it, the more I'm like, oh, you did it, didn't you? Then it makes it like, oh, well, then why should, because there are other pipelines going to Europe from Russia. Then it's like, well, then why should we supply you with any gas at all? and gives them more of a kind of gas-related casus belli to not supply Europe with gas heading into the winter and to amplify the energy crisis in Europe that's already become pretty intense, and it's not even October, and to basically sow chaos in Europe and make the European public less supportive of supporting Ukraine, create political chaos, topple certain governments in Europe that support Ukraine, etc. So I could see it being Russia for those reasons. I could see it being, the Baltic countries or Poland or Ukraine doing it in order to basically kick Germany in the ass and say, speed it up and stop being so dependent on Russian gas and, find alternatives faster. Because what would be crazy to me, but the Russians do this all the time, cutting off your nose to spite your face, is that as much as, because it was kind of the gas wars were kind of mutually assured destruction.
Right.
And as much as Russia threatened Europe with shutting off the gas, it was like, well, sure, but you need to sell the gas. Like, you can't eat the gas, you can't actually put it in your people's cars. Like, it funds your budget. You can't pay pensions and gas. All those gas pipelines go west, not east, right? Like, Russia doesn't really have that many LNG terminals. People are already not buying as much Russian oil, and they're buying it at discounts. And by people, I mean countries. And so much of the Russian federal budget is based on oil and gas. So, okay, if you're not selling any gas to Europe, how are you going to fill your coffers? How are you going to pay for your weapons? How are you going to pay your soldiers? How are you going to pay your pensioners? You're already hearing reports out of Russia that pensioners are getting certain like pension bonuses and cost of living adjustments that they've gotten, these kind of cost of living like COLA bonuses that they've gotten in recent years taken away in the last few months because they're like, oh, sorry, we're helping the Donbass. So, when you stop gas exports to Europe, you have to stop paying for certain things at home. And that's also politically risky when, as you can see, the political situation inside Russia is not as stable as the Kremlin thought. So,
But they were not selling gas through these pipelines anyway. Nord Stream 2 had never opened, and they had already shut down production or through Nord Stream 1 in
right.
precisely the biting your nose to spite your face kind of way that you describe. See, Germany will show
Right.
you. And so the marginal cost of damage to the pipeline is really about the speed and cost of getting them up and running at some later date, right?
If they can be repaired. But yeah, I think before they could always just turn Nord Stream 1 back on. And they could always say like, "Oh yeah, it's just we're just repairing them," and you know, they could always be about to turn it back on.
And are you confident that the prevalent idea in the Trumpist right among Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk that this may have been a U.S. operation has no basis to it at all?
I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't think we know yet. I don't think we've seen much evidence. Right now it's all like deciding on a verdict just based on motive, and I don't think we know enough yet.
Yeah, so we'll have, I mean, one of the interesting features is that it's not clear what a mechanism by which we would make that judgment would look like, right? I mean,
What do you
presume
mean?
well, so like who's the authority who gets to pronounce on this and say, we are the relevant investigative authority for this part of international waters, and we determine that it's not like when that
I
airliner was
mean,
shot
I
down.
don't look, personally, if a European intelligence agency or the American intelligence community came out and said, we've assessed that it was the Russians, I would believe them more than I would believe people on Twitter or Tucker Carlson. Like, that is a more credible source to me.
So you're just waiting for some credible authority to make an assessment rather than making it on the basis of perceptions of motive and interest alone.
Yeah, I think that would give me, that would at least, you could at least then say, like, according to X, it was the Russians, right? Like, right now it's, even after the Malaysian airliner went down, we knew pretty quickly who it was because the separatists, we immediately had the overheard call from the separatists being like, oh shit, we shot down an airliner.
Right.
So,
Yeah. This
you
was a
know,
little more professional than that.
yeah. Yeah, we know a little bit, like it has to be somebody who kind of has the capabilities, but in that neighborhood a lot of people have the capabilities,
I'm not agnostic. And I think that's the product of having served in government. Democratic governments are loath to undertake these kind of clandestine, dirty tricks type of campaigns. So it's not going to be the US. It's not going to be the UK. It's not going to be the Germans. It's probably not going to be anybody in the EU. It's unlikely that it's Poland, although now we're starting to get into less, frankly, clarity. It's not likely to be the Baltics. It's possible, but unlikely that it's the Ukrainians. It's kind of the Ukrainians have shown a enormous amount of capability to do all sorts of really, really interesting, cool stuff to the Russians, but they're unlikely to be effective in the Baltics at these kind of activities. It's not in their bailiwick. I think, given the fact that we've used deduction, we've eliminated, as Sherlock Holmes would say, all the things that are impossible. Then what we're left with is likely. I think it's likely, quite likely, that it's the Russians. The Russians indicating that this is an area where they could take additional action. The Russians testing, as I predicted they would for a long time, security, energy security, or physical security of NATO, and we're going to find that out relatively soon. But I think it was the Russians. There are some other technical issues as to how you could conduct maritime or subsurface activities, and Russia has a lot more capabilities there than, frankly, just about anybody else. I think it's a warning, and I think that the Russians. This kind of goes back to something that you said earlier. What was Putin expecting? Does he understand, like, the repercussions of some of these escalations, these annexations? I think the fact is that there's a clearer expectation that they don't think things are going to normalize with the West anytime soon. They think that the Russophobes are there to stay, and they don't think that Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream 1 are likely to be in play, and that they're okay sending the signal that there is nothing to do for, like, this coming winter with regards to gas transit.
We are going to leave it there. Alex Vindman, Julia Ioffe, thanks so much for joining us today. The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Our audio engineer this episode was me. I did it myself. Hey folks, we really need you to sign up for Lawfare's Patreon. Become a material supporter today at patreon.com/lawfare. That's patreon.com/lawfare. You know why, and you can avoid the ads. The Lawfare podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. And as always, thanks for listening.